Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called 4 Flawed Masterpieces. And this has come as a reaction to my recent video where I went through what I thought were the 10 greatest double albums of all time. Now, for many bands, a double album, especially when they sort of reach sort of peak success, is often this thing that they want to pull off to show that they are at the peak of their game. And a lot of bands, when they are at the peak of their game, they attempt a double album. And for many bands, it's that bridge too far. And so when we start to look at different albums and different bands through the years, we often will think there's many classic bands that have attempted the double album. And for the hardcore fans, they absolutely love this album. But a double album's a hard thing to pull off. And you sit down and listen to it, and it's always like they've had to stretch what they're trying to do just that little bit too far. Even if you fill an album up with great songs, over a double album, it's asking a lot for the audience to sit there and travel their way through. Now, there's a number of double albums that I think are held high in the fans' idea of great albums because they are double albums, and they would be albums like Blonde on Blonde. They would be albums like London Calling. These are albums which I think are seen as being the great album by that band because they're double albums. They have an epic quality to them. I actually don't think those albums are as great as everybody says, but there are 4 albums that I think are absolutely great and are essentially flawed because they are double albums. And when I'm trying to rank videos, I hit this album and I think, oh, it's this troublesome album, and I have to try and deal with it in the list. So on this video, what I want to try and do is really talk about these 4 flawed double albums and have a chat about what I think about them in terms of why I don't think they're masterpieces and yet why certain people do. The albums in question are going to be, in no particular order, Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. It is going to be Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin, and The Wall by Pink Floyd. Now, there's certain similarities with these albums, and there's also differences as well. So let's just go through those. None of these albums are like the first album that these bands make. It's very rare that someone would kick off with a double album as their debut album. Frank Zappa with Freak Out is an example of that. This is where the band is at an absolute peak. They have sold millions and millions, and when they turn around to the record company and say, we want to put a double album out, they go, yeah, sure, whatever you want. And that's definitely the case with all 4 of these albums. 3 of these albums are conceptual. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Tales from Topographic Oceans, and The Wall are conceptual albums. Now, I actually think that when people are trying to create some sort of rock opera, or some sort of conceptual album, a double album may be the place where they need to put this material out because they can't fit it on one single album to get through the whole concept or story. But often when you've got a concept, as you try and go through this and tell the story, you let go of the musical aspects of it. And so these albums tend to dip as the band has to trawl through trying to get to the point of the story with all this music, which is a little bit subpar. Now, all of these 3 albums are conceptual, but they're all conceptual in different ways. Tales from Topographic Oceans contains 4 20-minute tracks, each of their own. They're their own thing, and they all relate not to a story, but to some sort of spiritual teachings by a Yogi Pravanada, that John Anderson had discovered at the time. And so that's linked together by a sort of almost like spiritual metaphysical view of the world. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is a surreal conglomeration of sorts of the English aesthetic that Genesis had come from, with a sort of American, almost like musical aesthetic mixed with a sort of street New York aesthetic. And it's very interesting because Genesis never went near this again and hadn't done before. So Lamb Lies Down sort of occupies its own space. It is like it's very hard to compare it to any other Genesis album. Unlike Tales from Topographic Oceans, which is a natural extension of that. The Wall is again is the same sort of thing. That it's a concept, but it's telling a story. It's almost like a rock opera. But the thing that makes that one different, it was recorded post-punk. And I think Pink Floyd are an interesting band that they're able to deliver a prog epic post-punk because they never relied on virtuosity or over-arrangement. It's much more conceptual anyway. There's like a political framework that Roger Waters gradually puts onto the band. And when I talk about that album on its own, we'll get really deeply into this. Physical Graffiti is the opposite. Physical Graffiti is basically cobbled together by some sessions that were done by Led Zeppelin in 1974 with various outtakes from the three previous albums, notably Led Zepp 3, Led Zepp 4 and Houses of the Holy. And so Physical Graffiti is slightly different, okay? It's slightly different to the rest of the albums, but all of them are linked by the bands trying to pull off something bigger than they had pulled off before. And what's interesting, except for The Wall, Physical Graffiti, Lamb Lies Down, and Topographic were all made in a period between 73 and 75, right? And actually, if you look at the sessions for Physical Graffiti, it's 1974. And so those double albums actually come out in a 2-year period, which is very interesting. It's almost like this is the 2-year domain. This is where the industry thought they could get away with this because of the album sales, right? So I've given you some sort of background, a bit of an introduction to sort of how to think about these 4 albums and why they're linked together. Let's start off with going through them one by one now. Have a little bit of a chat about each one. So the one I want to start off with is, if we went in sort of chronological order, we should really start with Physical Graffiti because some of those sessions go back to 1970. But I will class that as being made in 1974. And so we will go back to 1973 with Tales from Topographic Oceans. Now, this is almost like the classic overblown double album from a band that has become overindulgent. It has a cultural reference to it, especially a few years back, where it was seen as almost like the evidence of the crime of progressive rock. This is how bad the progressive rock bands were. You know, they were so overindulgent, and yes, made a whole double album, you know, all based around this weird spiritual metaphysical stuff. And they spent millions on it, and they took a load of time in the studio to make it. And they wanted the studio to be like have a rustic setting, you know, so they had the hay bales put in there, and they had a cow that you could milk, and all this folklore that's emerged around this album. Okay, now the thing with this album, unlike the others, I think this does have a bad reputation out in the real world, but amongst Yes fans, there are many Yes fans that think this was entirely successful and is actually their greatest album. As a kid, I was really into Yes, and I got the Yes album, then I bought Yes shows, and I bought Fragile, then I bought Close to the Edge, then I bought the first Yes album, and then I went and got Tales from Topographic Oceans. And I remember putting it on, and to be quite frank with you, I was bemused by it. To me, at that age, being a massive Yes fan and them being my favourite band, I have to be honest, I listened to it and I got a little bit bored. I got most bored with the second epic on side 2 of the first disc. As the thing went on, me being a bit of a jazz fusion fan, once it got to the last the last 2 tracks, there was more soloing from Steve Howe, and there was a lot of drumming, and there was actually like drum solos on it, and I was very impressed with this. So this is an example where someone can have their own view of it, which is very specific, because I don't think most people who don't like it see it like that. They see the really indulgent one as being the third one, which I could tell you the track. I know the last one's called Ritual, the third one's called The Ancient, is it? So The Ancient, which is like a drum solo, not sound effects. I thought the groove on that was very clever. What we've got here, I think, in truth, is an album which is a little bit overblown. A little bit overblown. I think the truth lies somewhere between the fans' take, which is their masterpiece, and you have to really, this is the peak of the Yes Mountain, and you have to climb up it and you have to meet it there. And I agree with that. Some albums you do need to do that. You got to sit in a dark room, put the album on from beginning to end, focus and concentrate and follow the themes and the compositions through. It's not an easy listen, and I accept that. But on the other side of it, we do have Rick Wakeman's opinion, who played on the album, and it was disenchanted with the approach, that felt that there was a very good single album there. Well, if you put that under the microscope, yeah, it would have been a very exciting album, because what you would have been taking out is a lot of the guff. And a lot of the guff comes from Rick Wakeman. That's the first thing I noticed, especially on side 2. I wish I could remember the name. The first one's called The Revealing of Science and God. But the second one I can't remember. And the reason I can't remember it is because it was so boring. And it was boring because it had loads of waffly Rick Wakeman on there. So that's the first thing. Also, if you were to take these and edit it down into a single album, it would completely destroy what the album's trying to do, wouldn't it? Now, it reminds me of The Hobbit by Peter Jackson. We all as proggy types love Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Absolutely brilliant. And then he came back and he did The Hobbit. And with The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, he'd had to take 3 huge books and condense them down into 3 films. With The Hobbit, they took a book that was like this big and you could read in 2 afternoons and tried to expand it out over 3 films. And there's a lot of padding and a lot of silliness, a lot of action sequences are just ridiculous, a lot of padding, basically. A few years ago, I found a 4-hour edit of that, taking out all the silliness, taking out a lot of the action scenes and paring them down. And when you watched it, you went, "Oh my God, this is really, really good." It's a fan-made thing, and I watched that and thought, from now on, I'm only ever going to watch this version of it. I'm never going to go back to the Peter Jackson Hobbits. And so it does make you wonder whether something like that could be achieved. What you would probably have to do is create a single album that was an hour long with 4 3/4 of an hour to 10 minutes. So it's not that much has got to come off. It would be very interesting for somebody to try and do that. Maybe I am the man to do this, to try and edit Topographic Oceans down. And the big question is, I don't know whether this is the right thing to do. Basically, what I'm describing here with Topographic Oceans is there is a split. It's not that everybody thinks this is terrible. It's not that everyone thinks it's the best thing. There's a spread of opinion. My opinion is there's something in the middle of this. So I think it would be silly to say that this album could be better than Close to the Edge. I think it's not as good as Fragile, and I'm going to talk about Fragile in another video, because in a way, Fragile is Yes's finest hour. So that's flawed, but it's flawed in a different way. And I think it's flawed by one track. There's one track on there that if you just got rid of that and changed the sequencing of it, it would be an absolute masterpiece. But it needs some discussion, this does. And this is the point. If I was grabbing one album of Yes that I was going to have on my desert island, a desert island disc, basically, I would have, I'd have Fragile. I would. It's just peak Yes. And this is the point. You can have a brilliant album which is flawed, but the brilliant bits are brilliant. And because they're so brilliant, the flawed parts sort of make the album have a little bit more of a story. You don't have to be completely perfect. So I now have to relate my sort of final story about Tales from Topographic Oceans. Is many years later, we installed one of those Alexa things in the house. And I said, play some Yes. And it went, you haven't paid for Amazon Prime, so we will not pay any Yes, but we can play some music that's like Yes. I went, okay then. And so it played me some music that's like Yes. And this track started up. And it was actually that side 2 of side 1 of disc 1 of Tales from Topographic Oceans. So this starts up. And because I hadn't listened to it, it's the one thing that I hadn't listened to for probably 30, 40 years. So I didn't recognise it. Of course, straight off I knew it was Yes. I'm thinking, what Yes is this? Do I know this? What's this off? What could this be? It couldn't be off Tomato, because I didn't know Tomato that well at the time. I've since listened to it quite a bit. And I thought, it's got to be off Tales from Topographic Oceans, but I don't remember it. And as this progressed, I was sat there thinking, oh my God, this is peak Yes. Absolutely peak Yes. And one of the things that makes it so interesting is, for a lot of us, the Bruford period of Yes, which actually only over a 60-year career, lasts for 4 years, and then a little bit when he comes back and does all that stuff later on, the union stuff with them. But because that sort of Bruford makes it classic, but actually when Alan White comes in, his sound creates another Yes sound, which I absolutely love, and it's almost like classic Yes, and we hear it on Relayer, and we hear it on Awaken, which is off Going for the One, which I believe is Yes's finest hour. I really do. And so Alan White coming in, he changes it as well. And I wonder how much that had an effect, that suddenly it wasn't quite the Yes that everybody knew. And with, they'd lost that, the crack of that highly tuned snare for the great big Bonhamy drums of Alan White, So, but my take on Topographic Oceans is that I actually don't know. I could easily go, right, let's just go in for it. This is the best Yes album. Let's just commit to it. And then I'll start putting that on. And that should, so and this is the aspect of the flawedness of Yes, is that unknown thing. Now let's move on now to the next one chronologically, which would be, I'm going to go for Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now for me, when I bought Lamb Lies Down on Broadway as a youngster, the first prog Genesis album I ever bought was Nursery Crime. I'd got Three Sides Live before that. That was actually the first one. And when I heard that In the Cage section on side 3 of Three Sides Live, I thought, my God, this is the best music ever. What album's In the Cage off? Oh, it's off this Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So I went and bought Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, to only be really let down by the versions that were on that album compared to the Three Sides Live epic, sort of medley that they do on that, which just didn't sound the same. But Lamb Lies Down for me became an instant favourite. And the Through story, for me, although it was surreal, there was a story that you could follow. On me being a little bit of an anal retentive teenager at the time, I loved the fact that you could open this album up and it had all this symbolism in there, and then it had this story that you could read. So you could follow the story through, so you could follow it very easily. It just didn't make any sense, but that made it more interesting. Genesis, they are sort of musically at their peak, but also, and I think this is something, because I'm trying to find what unifies these 4 albums, and I couldn't come up with something, but now I'm shooting the video, I realised what it is, and I'll save it to the end, and that will be the sort of, I've just realised something about this album. You may have too, if you're following what I'm saying. Anyway, so Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is very different. Peter Gabriel, who was one of the posh boys from Charterhouse, who had obviously been educated in sort of Greek myths and English history, and was able to sort of channel that into this sort of quirky, weird, progressive rock band that Genesis were, also had a voice that was drawing on rhythm and blues, soul and funk and all that type of stuff. And on Lamb Lies Down, he tries to do, which I think is one of the noble things progressive rock bands do, and he tries to take on American music, but from an English perspective, which goes right back to the Beatles and the Kinks. I mean, this is the big thing about rock music. It's those two things combined. With Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, it almost plays out like a Hollywood musical. And it's fantastical in that way. So we've got this, the Americanization is almost like sort of a Busby Berkeley Hollywood musical mixed with, Dante's Visit to the Underworld or Milton or Pilgrim's Progress. It's got that very English sort of Canterbury Tales type thing as somebody goes on an odyssey, basically. This American immigrant Puerto Rican vandalizing graffiti artist goes on a journey. And what's interesting is Gabriel takes on that role. Now, the story is so weird, there is no reason why Genesis would have had to be encumbered by the story. And I have to be honest, when I first listened to it, unlike Topographic Oceans as a teenager, I just loved it. And it was only later when I was doing this channel and I start to, do all the research that I do, believe it or not, for some of my videos, that I started to see that there was a lot of people that felt Lamb Lies Down on Broadway sagged. I think they believe it sags on the second disc, probably the side 3, basically. That's where they felt it sags. As the story sort of gets convoluted, and you've got Rail running around, and then some little blackbird's gone and stolen his private parts and stuck it in a test tube and it's flying around. All this just weird stuff's going on. I don't think it's that the story. If you're following the story, it's actually rooted in reality at the start. You have this idea that he's in New York, he's vandalizing, and then this sort of veil turns down, and it turns around. It sort of suddenly the artifice of reality just drifts away, and all that is you can follow all that. It's all magical, but then once you're in this sort of Oz-like space that he's put Rail in, it's just all these weird things going on, and you're dealing with slubberdigoblians and the Lamia and all this sort of stuff. I got to be honest, I loved it. And I think this is why I think the fans don't like it. Because Genesis have moved on. And they're moving on to a place which they never actually got to. Because then Peter Gabriel left. And then they carried on. They actually go a little bit more back to their prog roots. And, Steve Hackett steps forward. And you get Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering, which are really brilliant. They're equal to the prog albums that went before. And then with Hackett going, it's Hackett that takes the prog away, not Peter Gabriel. That's something to understand. But what we have here is Peter Gabriel bringing in another aspect. And when I went back and researched this, and I was going through some of the songs on that album, I listened to Counting Out Time. This must have been a stretch for progressive rock fans, because Counting Out Time lyrically is absolutely bizarre and dark, but the music is like a Billy Joel or Elton John song, and it's very catchy. I'm just counting out time, or even Gilbert O'Sullivan, or even the Wombles. It could be the Wombles, couldn't it? And I think there's many moments. There's the Waiting Room where they go full to sort of avant-garde abstract darkness. It's got a wider palette of stuff, and I think I loved that, right? But I think the fans actually found the slight change in style, which was there, but they're going, where's Supper's Ready? Where's Watcher of the Skies? There's no epic on there. The whole thing's an epic, but it's all lots of little tracks. And one of the things that's interesting with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is when you get to the end, the climax is it. And it as a climax is not a prog climax. It's just an affirmation of the joys of life. And it's just a fast, fun track. It's not got the great big, sort of heavens opening and the gates of delirium opening and the big organ taking us down to the, big ending. And the reason is because Genesis know the game's over. Yes, don't on Tales from Topographic Oceans. They think they rule the world. And they think, right, let's go even further out. If we can pull off close to the edge of selling a million albums, maybe we could do it with this, with an album that's even bigger. And they don't realise that the world's changing, whereas Genesis do. Gabriel understands it, and then he goes to a solo career, which I don't believe is progressive rock. He becomes a straight rock stroke pop artist. And moves through a whole bunch of stuff, starts having hit records and becomes a pop star. And the first thing I ever came across Genesis was with the release of Salisbury Hill as a very youngster, and seeing him singing that. And I can't remember the title of it now, but these were like on the charts, on the TV all the time. And so he goes another route. And so what we have with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is, what is the flawed aspect of that? And I think it's an anomaly in Genesis's catalogue. It's nothing to do with the plot, being stretched out. That probably does happen a little bit, but it's much more been an anomaly. And so you either love it or you hate it. And if you bought into Selling England by the Pound on Foxtrot, and then you go to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway thinking you're going to get that more, it doesn't deliver that, which in effect Topographic Oceans does. So we've dealt with the two progressive rock albums. Let's move on to Physical Graffiti. Right, so Physical Graffiti is another double album which many Led Zeppelin fans thinks their finest hour, and I never have, right? And I listened to it a lot, and the flawedness of it makes me go back to it more than maybe the albums I do think are absolutely brilliant, which would be like Led Zeppelin 4 or contentiously Presence, which I think they don't put a foot wrong on that album. What's interesting with Led Zeppelin is they formed in 1969. They become the biggest band in the world very, very quickly. I had a book which went through the biggest selling albums of the 1960s. And when you got to the biggest selling albums, there was 100 albums in there. When you got to the last sort of 5, I think at number 3 was Led Zepp 1. and number 2 was Led Zepp 2. And so they outsold everybody else in the whole of the 1960s in 1 year. So the success is unfathomable. And so they formed 68. They go out and do the New Yardbirds tour, some of those dates, and they go into the studio, and that's where they start to become Led Zeppelin. And there's a documentary coming out which is going to look at that very thing, which is very interesting. They go and record that first album, and it's a huge success. So by 69, they're the biggest band in the world. And then they start making these albums very quickly. And if you look at the run between Led Zepp 1 and House of the Holy, we are dealing with 3 years. 3 years. Now, if Led Zeppelin had stopped at that point, we would still have half of Physical Graffiti and we would have half of Coda. And so put that together, we actually get another album out of it. Now, if you take that out, what we would lose is In Through the Outdoor, Presence, and half of Physical Graffiti. This is a really weird way to look at it. That in their 12-year career, the vast majority of classic tracks that we know as being the Led Zeppelin classic, Immigrant Song, Stay Out of Heaven, Whole Lot of Love, are made in a very, very short period where they're very productive, right? And then in 73, they start to overreach themselves because they're the biggest band in the world. Up until then, they seem to handle it. You think of Led Zeppelin 2, that's recorded whilst they're becoming the biggest band on. So they were on tour at that point, but they still managed to do something quite incredible with that album. 73, they try and make a film, Song Remains the Same, and it doesn't come out. We don't see it. 74, they go into the studio, and that album doesn't come out. We just don't see it. And then in 75, they decide to make a double album. Now, it's quite obvious to me that they could have made a single album. And if they'd made a single album, that album would have contained In the Light, Custard Pie, In My Time of Dying, Trampled Underfoot, and Kashmir. Now, I have to be honest, though that's Zeppelin in the studio in 74, and there's a few others as well, but if you look at the ones they did in 74, it's still peak Zeppelin. They're still delivering, right? But the other tracks that are outtakes from earlier albums, okay? The Rover, which I think is a fantastic track, is an outtake, I think, from, it could be Led Zepp 3. Down by the Seaside is an outtake from Led Zepp 4, and House of the Holy is obviously an outtake from House of the Holy. So you have to understand that. Now, Houses of the Holy and The Rover are also classic tracks, and I wonder why they weren't on the original albums. Why didn't they put, why didn't they put Houses of the Holy? Why didn't they, sod off bloody Jamaica? I mean, it's cool and everything, but, it does give, I don't know. I mean, it's all subjective, isn't it? Anyway, I don't know. This is the problem when you're doing this, really. If I'm really honest with you, and I am trying to be honest, I actually don't know. But anyway, I'm trying to talk about it and get a shape on it. And one of the interesting things with Physical Graffiti, anyways, it's got outtakes on. So they decided not to put them on the original albums. And I would imagine because it could say they didn't fit the sequence of the album, but you could say because they were a bit subpar. And for me, the second disc of Physical Graffiti is a bit subpar. Down by the Seaside, it's probably my least likeable Zepp song. The last side on Physical Graffiti is full of lots of weird acoustic stuff, which sounds like some of the weird acoustic stuff that's on Led Zepp 3. There's a lot of it. There's some cool songs on there. Sick Again is good, but that's lyrically a bit dodgy and nobody wants to hear that now. Night Flight's good, but in the middle of that, there's just guff. 10 years gone. I mean, but the first disc, if that first disc had come out as it was, and maybe if you took if you'd put In the Light as an epic, but how would you program it? It's difficult, isn't it? But my point is here, there is a brilliant Led Zeppelin album there, but they decided to expand this out with these outtakes. And on top of this, I think the reason why this happened, and this is where we get to the flawed aspect of physical graffiti, the problem there, is again, they're overreaching themselves. They'd done this huge tour, 72, 73. They conquered America. And John Paul Jones has had enough, and he left the band at this point. So when they rocked up into the studio in 1974, there was no John Paul Jones there. Now, what John Paul Jones had done had been the arranger for Led Zeppelin, and he'd reached the peak with House of the Holy. And for me, when I listen to House of the Holy and Led Zeppelin 3 and Led Zeppelin 4, it's the incredible arrangement skills of John Paul Jones that makes these albums amazing. His ability, to sit in a mellotron and voice what sounds like an orchestra, or have flutes or recorders or mandolins. You listen to something like Battle of Evermore, and you know that John Paul Jones has had such an influence on the arrangement of that. And a lot of the time with physical graffiti, when they're at their best, that arrangement isn't quite there. And I'm going to be quite sacrilegious. When I listen to something like Kashmir, it's incredible in what it is. That riff and the way it sounds and the drum sound, it's so clever. But it does lack for me taking you on a journey that I find when I listen to the Battle of Evermore, the middle section of Battle of Evermore, the middle section of Four Sticks, which is incredible. But Kashmir just exists. Trampled Underfoot just exists. In My Time of Dying is just them being one of the great blues rock bands of all time, just playing, and it just exists. Custom By just exists. In the Light does it, but again, it doesn't quite have. And these are the tracks I absolutely love, and I do love them, but they don't quite blow me away. I hadn't thought I'd say that. I thought I was going to say there's masterpieces on there. I've got to be honest, the masterpieces that are on there, for me, aren't quite. Kashmir, I know everyone loves it. I know Jimmy Page did a P. Diddy version. I don't think anyone wants to mention that now, do they? And all that type of thing. But I love it when it comes on, but then halfway through, and it just keeps going back between those two parts. I don't know. I just don't think the arrangement's there, and it's quite obvious the arrangement's not there because at a certain point, John Paul Jones is not there. And as I said on the other video, when I did play with Rob Plant, he actually sat me down and he played me some recordings from the physical graffiti sessions of him, Bonham, and Jimmy Page just jamming out Elvis Presley songs, and quite incredible. And you can see from that a lot of the arrangements that you hear for Trampled Underfoot, Kashmir, could have easily been done with just guitar and drums. There's that aspect of it. And you see this with Led Zeppelin albums. The following album, Presence, is going to be all Jimmy Page. It's a guitar album. The following album after that, In Through the Outdoor, is all John Paul Jones. But however you look at it, the magic of a band, this is where we're at, the magic of the band being a band had burnt out by 73. They were a bunch of individuals, and much like the Beatles in 1967, bands have a certain shelf life, and they get to a point where they're no longer a band, they're a bunch of individuals. And often at that point, they attempt to make a double album. And this is definitely the case of Pink Floyd's The Wall. Now, as people know, I will say that Dark Side of the Moon is a sublime album. It's one of the greatest albums ever made. It will blow anybody away who sits and listens to it. Before then, Medal, absolutely incredible. There's all sorts of amazing, Careful with That, Axe Eugene, when it's sublime stuff. Astronomo, Domini, all the Sid Barrett. So there's all this stuff that's great before, and there's stuff that's great after, or is there? This is the thing. Wish You Were Here is a sublime album. It's absolutely incredible, but they lose all that sort of abstract noise, psychedelic thing that's on Dark Side of the Moon. It's just a straight album. And for me, Wish You Were Here is a brilliant album, but it's like a Dire Straits album to me. It's not quite my thing, but it is brilliant. I went back and listened to Animals, and if you watch me talk about Animals, I go, this is a really great album. They sort of went back to their prog roots. And the reason is because there's a great big epic on there called Dogs, and I went and put that on the other day. It's boring. Pink Floyd, for me, lose they seem to just fall into a trap after Dark Side of the Moon, where it becomes a little bit sort of this boring, ploddy, Dave Gilmour big guitar solo and Roger Waters going on about, you know, how he's a lefty rock star and he's alienated by that fact, you know, and he's spat on a fan. Because apparently he got so dislocated from what he was doing, so removed as a sort of rock star in the mid-70s, that some fans that were letting off fireworks, he got so annoyed at some gig, he spat on them. And with that spit became the influence for The Wall, which has to be seen as a great success for Pink Floyd, you know, because it had a huge hit record off it. It went around the world, a huge tour, and within a few years, a mainstream film. And it is one of the great rock operas of all time. But I think we all know that there's a lot of filler on that double album. And in terms of classic tracks, you've got Another Brick in the Wall, Comfortably Numb, Is Anybody Out There, Mother. They don't want only ones I can actually recall. The rest of it is just them trying to get through a very convoluted plot. And would be very easy for me to come on here and say that's the problem with that album. But I don't think it is. I think I've identified what brings these four albums together. Pink Floyd are an odd band. They're really formed around Syd Barrett. Syd Barrett is the visionary. Syd Barrett is the charismatic frontman that looks really good-looking bloke. That's got loads of charisma. He's the songwriter and he's the guitar player, you know. And so Pink Floyd is Syd Barrett's band. And the first album is great because of that. The second album, he's lost his way, and then we've not got Syd Barrett. And what you've got with Pink Floyd, obviously, Pink Floyd is one of these bands that's like, it's the product of English gentlemen. And English gentlemen, in their quiet way, know how to set a business up. And by the late 60s, for all the drug taking and weirdness that's going on with that band, they have set up a good, strong company, and they are sitting there making albums. And the record company just lets them do it, and they make album after album after album, which are really, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. They've got no songwriter particularly. They haven't got a lead singer. They haven't got any idea. And so what they do is they just go into the studio and they meddle. They just come up with weird things, and they get away with it because they're very organised English gentlemen, you know. So they've got all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, as they should do. The accounts are working well. And, you know, they get out and do their thing, and it's surprising how flawed those albums are. They really are flawed. Atom Heart Mother is a great album of progressive experimentation, and I love the epic Atom Heart Mother. I think it's incredible. And of course, with Medal, and the fans will say this, they go, oh, Medal is where the band found their sound, on Medal. Their sixth album, they found their sound, and they only found it on side 2 on the big track Medal. And Medal's incredible, but it does go on a little bit, but I do love it. I'm not going to knock that, it does go on, it's part of the charm of it. But side 1's bloody rubbish. And everyone goes on about that Seamus track, where they were so stuck for ideas they thought they'd play a blues and get somebody's dog called Seamus to sing over it. But for me, and I'm going to do a separate video on this track, before that there's a track, and I've forgotten what it's called. It's like a jazz pastiche. It's bloody awful. So Medal's not great. Obscured by Clouds is a good album, actually. I have come to see that's a lot better than I first thought it was. But right at the end of that, there's some weird thing. Anyway, but my point is, they're pretty disjointed. Roger Waters steps forward and he becomes the Syd Barrett of the band. He becomes the main songwriter. He gives the focus of the band. And Dave Gilmour becomes the great instrumentalist, who wasn't even on the first album. And so you've got the sort of Top Gear Jeremy Clarkson fan base that like Dave Gilmour's big guitar solos. And then you got the proggy revolutionary lot that like, you know, Roger Waters' Pigs and all that left-wing socialist stuff. And what happens is that, because that's Dark Side of the Moon, it's still homogenous. Those two things work really well on Wish You Were Here. It's not an album I like, but I can see that works really well. On Animals, Roger Waters is starting to get control. And by The Wall, he's got complete control. And it destroys the band, right? And that's what's flawed about it. You look at the credits, and you've got Jeff Porcaro on drums on a track. You've got Lee Ritenour coming in and doing guitar solos. They're no longer bands. And this is the thing that I want to get across on this video. This is the realization. What draws these four albums together, and why have I decided to collect them together, and why are they so troublesome? And I'm going to tell you why these 4 albums are so troublesome. They represent the great glory days of what we used to call progressive rock or underground rock. You know, I don't mean like Yes and Genesis. I'm on about these huge bands that sold millions and millions of albums, but the mainstream audience, like the moms and dads, didn't know anything about them. And they came out, and the album became the cultural artifact that you have to have. It took over from the Hollywood film, and albums became really important. And these bands became album artists. All 4 of them are album artists. And because they're making the album, there is a pressure on them to deliver the double album. Not a live double album, but a studio double album. And this is going to be epic. And what makes these 4 albums similar and flawed is that these bands had been elevated up and swept up, and they got on a journey. They had been given the chance to develop. And they developed to a point around about 72, 73, where they create absolute genius. And that allows them to then forge forward and do what everybody wants them to do, which is release the big double album. And I wonder if there was more profit in that for the record companies as well for a double album sale. Because Physical Graffiti, I once read a stat that when it came out, it was selling nearly 500,000 copies an hour at one point. I don't know if that's true or not, but I read that when I was a kid in an encyclopedia of rock. But it sold, these albums sold a huge amount, and obviously there's double the profit because the double albums were more expensive. Now, the big reason why they're flawed is that at this point, all of these bands, all 4 of them, were no longer a band. The magic that was there before had gone. The bands were at cracking point. Tales from Topographic Oceans, you had Bill Bruford gone, who was a seminal member of that band, and Rick Wakeman is on his way out. He's had enough. And so for the first time, they're in the studio, and the magic's not quite right. And although they're brilliant, you can see how brilliant they are as bands, but although they're brilliant, these albums are uneven because of not having the magic, right? With if I'd keep this up with Genesis, Gabriel's having a terrible time. He's had his child not well, and he's sat there looking at the baby in their little, what do you call them, that you stick a baby in a cot, and then you look at the bars of the cot and thinking, well, it looks like a cage, and he's all this, and he wants to go, and he tells the band that he wants to go, they have to finish the tour. So they're disjointed because they're losing Peter Gabriel, they're losing their front man. And when you lose a front man, that's it. Usually the band's had it at that point. You can't replace a front man. So the Genesis are faced with that. Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones has left the band. They have toured. They've turned into this multi-million band, the biggest band in the world, and they're falling apart. And Led Zeppelin were not formed from friendship. They're not like they're like were put together, not by the record company, but put together by Jimmy Page. These guys weren't friends. They have that 3 years together, and they want to go their separate ways. Led Zeppelin, the magic's gone. The magic's gone. They can still get in the room and play together. It sounds amazing. That's the thing with Led Zeppelin. With The Wall, it is now Roger Waters' band. And, at this point, Richard Wright was sacked during the making and then brought back on as a session musician. The whole thing is absolutely awful, really, what's going on. And I think that's what you hear. If you think about it, and you think of the Pink Floyd sound, or you think of the Led Zeppelin sound, or you think of the Yes sound, and then you think of the Genesis sound, all 4 albums are not quite that, are they? Because they've been pulled together by reputation, money, and legacy. That's the truth with these 4 albums. They're there because of the momentum of that band at that time. And so the momentum to keep the band together, to make some money. And what's going to happen, especially with the first 3 albums I've described, is that in 1976, the thing's going to come down around them. And it's interesting how they solve this. Because Yes solve it by actually bringing Rick Wakeman in. And I think Going for the One is in a way their last great final hour in terms of prog, yes, but they pull it off. In the midst of punk, they pull off Going for the One. And Going for the One sold way more albums than the whole punk scene put together. Please remember that. You know, Peter Gabriel leaves, has a solo career, and Genesis slowly changed themselves to becoming one of the biggest selling sort of pop bands of the 1980s. They solve it. Pink Floyd, they pull it off post-punk, as I said, because I think that sort of leftist revolutionary aspects chimed. And so I can remember punk happening and then Pink Floyd coming out with a bunch of kids shouting, "We don't need no education," and feeling that was very punk. So they were able to not be seen as like the effete hippies that Yes were. You know, Pink Floyd had always been faceless, so Pink Floyd could be a punk in the mind of the general audience. Led Zeppelin, I think from this point on, they are going to be, you know, have to have a catalogue of disasters, from Robert Plant's car crash to the death of his son Karak in 1977, is it 76, 77? The addiction of Jimmy Page, it really seems to take him almost out in Through the Outdoor, and then ending with the death of John Bonham. It's not going to be the same for them. And so these double albums, they sort of represent the end of that glory period. They're like, it's like if you have taking the Renaissance, you look at the early Renaissance stuff, and we suddenly see we see the individual suddenly emerge, and the statues are very realistic suddenly, and the people look very realistic, and then as that gets on, that realism goes into sort of an opulence, and then suddenly you've got the statue of David, and then the whole thing becomes so flowery and over the top. Right? And that's what it's like, the Rococo period of rock. That's what these double albums represent. They represent the high and the low together. And I think that is what makes them flawed. And why, when you compare a Topographic Oceans to a Fragile, it doesn't have the youthful exuberance, abandon of that. And The Wall doesn't have the youthful experimentation of Dark Side of the Moon. And Physical Graffiti doesn't have the sheer chutzpah of the first Led Zeppelin album or Whole Lot of Love, you know. And, you know, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway doesn't have the twee sort of Away with the Fairies of Nursery Crime or Foxtrot. And I think that's what it is. And I've tried to describe it on this video the best I can. I think I have done that. I hope you enjoyed this type of video. If you notice, I've done this now. I'm taking a few albums. They're not necessarily linked together, but I'm talking to them about them together to see if we can get some sort of truth out of this. And what do you get from this video? What have I basically described? What we've described is that bands have an arc. Bands at the start of bands, and it's people together because they got chemistry, and there's something going. There's great to the sum of their parts, but the very success that creates a landscape around that band that makes it very difficult for that band to continue. And where genius musicians were willing to work together at the start and put their artistic view to the side for the greater good, which meant you had four geniuses all working together in one. As it goes on and they become relaxed in their success, they then start to go, well, I would want to do it like this, this, and this. And they all want to then have their solo careers. And in the example of Peter Gabriel has a very successful solo career. Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant eventually comes out with a very successful solo career. Genesis transform into a pop band. You can see this is the beginning if they're able to keep going. And I have to be honest, all four bands in a way kept going and went on to have the other side of the mountain success that they did. You know, Pink Floyd probably the least. It's a topic for another video. It's a topic to look really at why bands like ELP just could not make it in the 1980s, and why a band like Genesis and Yes could. It's interesting, and what's interesting, ELP they never really had their big double album. I know they did Works, but Works is that is flawed, very flawed. Too flawed to even be considered as being a great album, really. But these four, I think we can consider are great albums. They're wonderful, and they're wonderful records of what we've been describing here, which is the opulence of rock music and how far it can go. And for anybody who loves that, they're going to love these albums. I've got to the end of the video now, so if you like this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see some more, you can subscribe. I have a Patreon, and the link's down below. All the links are down below there. Go and check them out. You can become a free Patreon or a paid-up member of Patreon. I also have a PayPal tip jar, and I have a button on here where you can donate some money if you want to give me a tip, and they really keep they keep the wolf from the door, that those donations do. I've just started up a Substack where you've got which is linked to Spotify, so you can listen to them, the interviews. I'm going to start doing podcasts. There's essays on there, so you can go and check that out. And I've also got a Bandcamp, which is now for subscription. You can become a subscriber to those. If you like what I do, go and click on the links and have an explore. There's a lot of stuff there. I'm trying to create my own little world. I'm not quite ready for my double album yet, but it's coming. I'm going to do it. I am going to do something epic here, right? But I haven't overreached myself yet. I haven't fallen out with myself. I'm going to have to fall out with myself at some point, aren't I? It can happen, because you see, every now and then I do split into two people, don't I? What are you talking about to them now? When I sort of start talking to myself. You're not talking to yourself, talking to me, the person who knows what you should be doing. He doesn't never listen. You're off your bloody head, you are. I'm not. I'm just trying to do my videos. That's what, so I might have to get those two characters that emerge every now and then. I mean, they're at each other's throats as it is. But one of them needs to take control and take the other person on. That's what needs to happen. We're done. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.